This is the story of a land caught between empires. A land of forests and rivers, of ice and mountains, where indigenous nations thrived for thousands of years before Europeans ever arrived. A land that would see the clash of French and British, the migration of loyalists fleeing revolution, and the struggles of peoples divided by language, religion, and history, yet destined to unite into something new. In the 19th century, the vast territories of British North America were colonies scattered across a continent. Divided by geography, by culture, and by politics, they seemed unlikely to form a single nation. And yet, external threats, economic necessity, and visionary leadership would push them toward unity. This is not the story of sudden revolution, nor of conquest. It is the story of compromise, of leaders who saw beyond their divisions, of peoples who chose negotiation over war, and of a new kind of nation, a dominion born not from rebellion, but from dialogue. On July 1st, 1867, that nation came into being. For provinces, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, bound together under a single flag as the Dominion of Canada, a self-governing entity within the British Empire. From that moment, Canada began its journey toward independence, identity, and nationhood. This is the story of the founding of Canada, a story of conflict and compromise, of vision and resilience, of how a people forged a nation in one of the harshest, most diverse landscapes on Earth. Long before Europeans arrived, the land we now call Canada was home to diverse indigenous peoples. From the Haudenosaunee in the east, to the Cree and Anishinaabe in the north, to the Haida and Coast Salish along the Pacific coast. Each nation had its own languages, traditions, and systems of governance. Trade networks stretched across vast distances, connecting the plains, forests, and coasts. These societies were sophisticated, resilient, and deeply tied to the land, a fact that would shape Canada's history long after colonization began. In the early 1600s, French explorers like Samuel de Champlain established settlements along the St. Lawrence River. This became the heart of New France, a colony built on fur, trading, and alliances with indigenous nations. The French brought Jesuit missionaries, settlers, and soldiers, but their survival depended on cooperation with indigenous partners who knew the land. For over a century, France and Britain vied for control of North America. The French established strongholds at Quebec and Montreal, while British settlers concentrated further south along the Atlantic coast. The struggle for dominance was constant through wars, trade rivalries, and shifting alliances with indigenous nations. The decisive moment came in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Known in North America as the French and Indian War, it pitted France and its indigenous allies against Britain and its colonies. In 1759, at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, British forces captured Quebec City, dealing a fatal blow to New France. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, formally ended the war and transferred most of France's North American territories to Britain. For the French-speaking population along the St. Lawrence, this meant adjusting to life under British rule, a challenge that would define Canada's dual identity for centuries. Just as Britain secured Canada, the American colonies to the south rose in revolt. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, reshaped the continent. When the revolutionaries triumphed, thousands of loyalists, colonists loyal to the British Crown, fled north. They settled in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and what would become Ontario, dramatically altering the demographic balance. This migration also reinforced Canada's identity as distinct from the United States. While Americans embraced revolution and independence, Canadians remained tied to the British Crown, valuing stability over upheaval. The contrast deepened in the War of 1812, when the United States invaded British North America. Battles raged along the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence. Indigenous leaders like Tecumseh allied with the British, playing a crucial role in resisting American advances. The war ended in stalemate, but for Canadians, it was a formative moment, proof that they could defend their land and their identity against powerful neighbors. The first half of the 19th century brought political and social challenges. The colonies of Upper Canada, Ontario, and Lower Canada, Quebec, struggled with governance under appointed elites, leading to resentment. In 1837 to 1838, rebellions broke out in both colonies, fueled by demands for more democratic government. Though quickly suppressed, these uprisings pushed Britain to introduce reforms, eventually granting responsible government, where colonial legislatures could control their own affairs. Meanwhile, the economy was changing. The fur trade declined, but agriculture, timber, and shipbuilding grew. Railways and canals began to connect distant colonies. Slowly, the idea that these scattered settlements could benefit from unity began to take hold. By the mid-19th century, the province of Canada, which combined Canada East, Quebec, and Canada West, Ontario, was plagued by political stalemate. The colony was governed by a legislature split evenly between the two regions. French-speaking Catholics in the East and English-speaking Protestants in the West often clashed over language, religion, and representation. Governments rose and fell rapidly, paralyzed by deadlock. This instability convinced many leaders that a broader solution was needed. If the colonies were to prosper, they needed a new system, one that allowed cooperation while respecting diversity. Economics also drove the call for change. The end of Britain's Corn Laws in 1846 meant that Canadian exports no longer received preferential treatment in British markets. Trade with the United States became vital, boosted by the Reciprocity Treaty of 1854, which allowed free exchange of natural resources across the border. But when that treaty was canceled in 1866, the colonies faced an urgent need to build stronger economic ties among themselves. Railways, particularly the ambitious Intercolonial Railway, promised to link distant provinces and create a unified market. Confederation offered a way to achieve this economic integration. Beyond politics and economics, external threats made unity seem essential. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, revealed the might of the United States, whose armies dwarfed anything the British colonies could muster. Many feared that U.S. expansionism would soon target Canada, especially after the Fenian raids of the 1860s, when Irish-American militias crossed the border to pressure Britain. At the same time, Britain itself was growing weary of the expense of defending its North American colonies. London encouraged the idea of a self-governing union that could take more responsibility for its own defense. Out of these pressures came a vision for unity. In 1864, delegates from Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island met at the Charlottetown Conference, originally convened to discuss maritime union. Instead, the Canadians persuaded their Atlantic neighbors to consider a larger federation. Later that year, at the Quebec Conference, leaders hammered out the details, a federal system balancing local autonomy with a strong central government. Visionaries like John A. Macdonald argued for national unity, while Georges-Étienne Cartier defended the rights of French Canadians. The framework agreed upon would eventually become the basis of Confederation. By the mid-1860s, momentum for union was unstoppable. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were persuaded to join through promises of economic development and railway links. Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland, wary of costs, stayed out for the time being. In London, colonial leaders lobbied the British Parliament to pass legislation creating the new Dominion. On March 29, 1867, the British North America Act received royal assent. It established a federal union of 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. The new country would be called the Dominion of Canada, with a capital in Ottawa and a parliamentary system modeled on Britain's, but with the autonomy to govern its own affairs. On July 1, 1867, the dream of union became reality. The British North America Act, passed by the British Parliament, officially united 4 colonies: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, into a single political entity, the Dominion of Canada. It was not full independence. Canada remained part of the British Empire, with foreign affairs and constitutional changes still under London's control. But it was the first time these provinces shared a single federal government, a prime minister, and a capital. It was the beginning of self-rule on Canadian soil. The new Dominion was built on a federal model. Power was divided between the central government in Ottawa and provincial legislatures. This system was designed as a compromise, allowing provinces to preserve local control, especially over language, religion, and education, while ensuring a strong central authority to manage defense, trade, and national development. At the head of the federal government stood the Prime Minister, with Sir John A. Macdonald as the first to hold the office. Known for his ambition and political skill, Macdonald envisioned a Canada stretching from sea to sea. Alongside him was Georges Etienne Cartier, who championed the protection of French-Canadian rights within the new system. Canada's new status was reflected in its symbols. It had its own parliament, its own flag, the red ensign, adapted with Canadian symbols, and its own identity as a self-governing dominion. Yet the Governor-General, appointed by Britain, still represented the Crown, a reminder that Canada was not yet fully independent. The word Dominion itself carried meaning. It suggested autonomy within empire, a nation in its own right, yet tied to Britain. For Canadians in 1867, this compromise struck the balance between loyalty to the Crown and the desire for self-government. From a very start, Confederation faced challenges. Nova Scotia was reluctant to join, with some politicians even calling for secession. The Maritimes worried they would be overshadowed by larger provinces. In Quebec, French Canadians watched carefully to see whether their language and Catholic faith would be respected. The new government had to prove that this union could work. And beyond the original 4 provinces lay vast lands still controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company or directly by Britain. If Canada were truly to become a nation stretching across the continent, it would have to expand westward, a task that would bring both triumph and tragedy. Confederation in 1867 was only the beginning. Within a few years, the Dominion began to expand. Manitoba joined in 1870, created after the Red River Resistance led by Louis Riel, which sought to defend Métis rights against encroaching settlers. British Columbia, lured by the promise of a transcontinental railway, entered Confederation in 1871. Prince Edward Island, initially hesitant, joined in 1873 after financial difficulties and Canada's offer to assume its debts. The Northwest Territories, purchased from a Hudson's Bay Company in 1869, became a vast frontier for settlement. Later, in 1905, Saskatchewan and Alberta were carved out of the Prairie West, adding 2 more provinces to the Federation. By the early 20th century, Canada stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific and into the Arctic, a continental nation. The key to holding this vast land together was the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR. Promised as a condition of British Columbia's entry into Confederation, it was one of the greatest engineering feats of its time. Built through mountains, forests, and prairies, completed in 1885, the CPR linked east to west, making settlement and trade possible across the continent. But the railway came at a cost. Thousands of laborers, including many Chinese immigrants, endured brutal conditions, dangerous work, and widespread discrimination. Indigenous peoples saw their lands crossed by steel tracks that brought settlers and soldiers, further eroding their autonomy. As settlers moved westward, the Canadian government negotiated the numbered treaties, 1871 to 1921, with Indigenous nations. In theory, these treaties promised land, education, and support in exchange for Indigenous consent to settlement. In practice, they often involved coercion, broken promises, and the forced relocation of communities. The government also created the residential school system, designed to assimilate Indigenous children by removing them from their families and erasing their languages and cultures. These policies would have devastating, long-lasting effects on Indigenous communities. To populate the prairies, Canada launched ambitious immigration campaigns. Settlers from Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, and elsewhere were encouraged to farm the vast grasslands. The West became a patchwork of new communities: Ukrainian, Mennonite, Icelandic, and more, each contributing to Canada's growing diversity. This wave of immigration transformed Canada's demographics and economy, fueling agricultural exports and strengthening the Federation. But it also deepened tensions, as Indigenous peoples were displaced and non-British immigrants often faced prejudice. Nation building was not only about land and railways. It was also about forging a sense of identity. English and French Canadians continued to wrestle with questions of language and culture. Religious divisions between Catholics and Protestants often spilled into politics. Regional differences, maritime concerns, Western alienation, Quebec's demands challenged national unity. Yet despite these divisions, Canada was emerging as something new, not a mere collection of colonies, but a young nation with continental reach, economic growth, and a slowly forming identity of its own. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1914, Canada, as part of the British Empire, was automatically at war. Yet what followed was a turning point in Canada's history. Over 600,000 Canadians served in the armed forces, and more than 60,000 never returned. Canadian soldiers distinguished themselves in key battles. At Ypres in 1915, enduring poison gas. At the Somme in 1916, suffering terrible casualties. And most famously at Vimy Ridge in 1917, where Canadian troops captured strategic position that others had failed to take. Vimy became a symbol of national pride, often described as the moment when Canada came of age as a nation. But the war also exposed deep divisions. The conscription crisis of 1917 revealed tensions between English and French Canadians. Many in English Canada supported compulsory military service, believing it was Canada's duty to the Empire. In Quebec, however, where ties to Britain were weaker and resentment of forced service ran high, conscription was fiercely opposed. The crisis nearly tore the country apart, leaving scars that would last for decades. It showed that Canada was united in sacrifice, but still divided in identity. By war's end, Canada had earned recognition on the world stage. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Prime Minister Robert Borden demanded that Canada sign the Treaty of Versailles in its own right. Though still part of the British Empire, Canada's signature stood alongside those of the great powers. That same year, Canada joined the newly formed League of Nations as an independent member, further confirming its growing autonomy. In the 1920s, Canada began to assert more independence in foreign affairs. The Chanock Affair, 1922, marked a turning point. When Britain asked Canada to send troops to defend its interests in Turkey, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King refused without consulting Parliament. This signaled that Canada would no longer automatically follow Britain into conflict. Similarly, the Halibut Treaty of 1923, a fishing agreement with the United States, was the first treaty signed by Canada without British involvement. These acts, though subtle, marked Canada's quiet shift towards sovereignty. The final confirmation came with the Statute of Westminster in 1931. This law, passed by the British Parliament, granted Canada and other dominions full legal independence in foreign and domestic affairs, while maintaining symbolic ties to the Crown. Canada was now, in law as well as in practice, a self-governing nation. The founding of Canada was unlike the dramatic revolutions that shaped many other nations. It was not born in a single battle or uprising, but through negotiation, compromise, and gradual transformation. From Indigenous nations whose lands formed its foundation, to French and English colonists, to loyalists, immigrants, and pioneers, Canada's story has always been one of diversity and complexity. Confederation in 1867 marked the birth of a dominion, a bold experiment in federalism, balancing unity with regional autonomy and preserving cultural identities within a larger whole. Yet Canada's nation-building was also marked by hardship and injustice. The dispossession of Indigenous peoples, the struggles of French-English relations, and the challenges of forging identity across vast distances. Through expansion, railways, settlement, and sacrifice in war, Canada slowly defined itself. By the time of the Statute of Westminster in 1931, it had become a fully self-governing nation, standing alongside Britain not as a colony, but as a partner in the Commonwealth. Canada's story is therefore not one of sudden independence, but of patience, resilience, and dialogue. It is a reminder that nations can be forged not only in revolution, but also in the hard work of compromise, in the willingness to share power, respect difference, and imagine a future together. From 4 provinces on the edge of empire to a continental nation, Canada's founding was the beginning of a journey still unfolding today. Born in compromise, tempered by struggle, it stands as a testament to the enduring strength of unity in diversity.